3 weeks after conception, before your heart has a single chamber, before your brain has a single fold, before you're anything more than a hollow ball of cells the size of a poppy seed, something inside you spins. Microscopic hairs, thinner than anything you could ever see with your own eyes, begin rotating in a tiny pit at the center of the embryo, pushing fluid in one direction and only one direction. That spinning motion is the first decision your body ever makes. It decides which side of you is left and which side is right. And buried inside that same ancient mechanism, most scientists now believe, is the answer to a question that has followed humanity for thousands of years. Why are some of us left-handed? And where does that difference actually come from? For most of recorded history, nobody thought to ask the question this way. If a child reached for a spoon with the wrong hand, it was treated as a defect in character, not biology. Parents saw stubbornness. Teachers saw a bad habit that needed breaking. In each of the several religious traditions, it was seen as something closer to corruption, a sign that the child was somehow out of alignment with what was right, quite literally. The word for left in Latin, sinister, drifted over centuries into a word for evil and misfortune. In French, gauche, the word for left, became the word for awkward and clumsy. Children in classrooms across Europe, Asia, and the Americas had their left hands tied behind their backs for hours, forced to write, eat, and gesture with the hand that didn't come naturally to them, all in the name of correcting something that was never broken in the first place. In several cultures across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, offering food or greeting someone with the left hand was treated as an act of disrespect, a social rule that, in some communities, still lingers today. Medieval European folklore occasionally went even further, associating left-handedness with witchcraft, treating a physical trait as if it were outward evidence of an inward moral flaw. None of it, as later science would eventually show, had anything to do with morality, character, or upbringing at all. It had to do with cilia, microtubules, and a molecular clock quietly ticking away inside a 3-week-old embryo, entirely beyond anyone's control. That belief, that handedness, was simply a habit that could be trained away, lingered for a surprisingly long time even inside scientific circles. Early psychologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries largely treated hand preference as a learned behavior, shaped by parents, by tools designed for the right hand, and by social pressure. It made a certain intuitive sense. You could force a child to switch hands, so didn't that prove it was simply a habit all along? But researchers who looked closer kept noticing something that habit alone couldn't explain. Even after aggressive right-hand training, many people who had been forced to switch as children still showed clear signs of underlying left-hand dominance elsewhere, in which foot they instinctively led with, in which eye they used to aim a camera, and in subtle, measurable patterns of brain activity. You could suppress the outward behavior. You couldn't erase whatever was generating it underneath. What almost nobody realized for nearly the entirety of human civilization was that the preference for one hand over the other doesn't begin in the classroom or even at birth. It begins in the womb. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers using ultrasound imaging started tracking fetal movement in detail, and they noticed something remarkable. Somewhere around the 15th week of pregnancy, long before a baby can be held or taught anything, most fetuses already show a clear, consistent preference for sucking one particular thumb over the other. When those same children were followed for years after birth, the hand they had favored in the womb reliably predicted the hand they favored as toddlers, as schoolchildren, and as adults. No parent had trained that preference. No teacher had shaped it. It was already there, encoded somewhere in the developing nervous system, months before the outside world could have any influence at all. That discovery forced scientists to stop looking at handedness as a habit and start looking at it as biology. And once they started looking, they ran into a wall almost immediately, because the biology refused to behave the way simple inheritance is supposed to behave. Left-handed parents are somewhat more likely to have left-handed children. That part is true. But two right-handed parents can absolutely have a left-handed child, and two left-handed parents very often have children who grow up entirely right-handed. Identical twins, who share essentially the same genome down to the letter, frequently don't share the same dominant hand. In a striking number of cases, identical twins turn out to be mirror images of each other, one favoring the left hand, the other favoring the right, as though some internal coin had been flipped independently in each twin during development. If a single gene controlled handedness the way a single gene controls something like earlobe shape, that kind of mismatch between genetically identical people should almost never happen. And yet it happens constantly. Large twin studies eventually put a number on how much of handedness could be explained by genetics alone, and the figure that kept coming up was roughly 25%. An important piece of the puzzle, but nowhere close to the whole picture. The remaining variation seemed to come from something researchers began calling developmental noise, the countless small, semi-random events that occur as an embryo's cells divide, signal to each other, and organize themselves in those first delicate weeks. Even with identical genetic instructions, Two developing embryos can land on different outcomes, the same way two coins with a slight, invisible imperfection can still occasionally land on opposite sides. Before geneticists had the tools to test any of this directly, one particularly influential theory tried to explain the gap using hormones instead of genes. In the early 1980s, the neurologist Norman Geschwind proposed that elevated testosterone exposure in the womb could slow the growth of the brain's left hemisphere relative to the right, nudging some developing fetuses toward left-hand dominance. The idea captured a huge amount of attention at the time, in part because it offered a single tidy mechanism. But as more rigorous studies were carried out over the following decades, the results came back mixed, inconsistent, and often contradictory. Today, most researchers in this field consider the strong version of the testosterone hypothesis unsupported by solid evidence, a reminder that even an elegant theory has to survive contact with better data, and this one largely didn't. The real breakthrough came from an entirely different, almost accidental direction: medical research into a rare condition called situs inversus, in which a person's internal organs form as a mirror image of the typical layout. Heart shifted to the right side of the chest, liver shifted to the left. Scientists studying this condition were trying to answer a much more basic question. First, how does a developing embryo decide which side of the body is left and which is right in the first place, when every cell at the earliest stage looks completely identical to every other cell around it? And what they found was that this decision happens astonishingly early, within the first weeks after conception, and it comes down to those spinning hair-like structures called cilia, clustered inside a tiny node at the center of the embryo. As the cilia rotate in a coordinated pattern, they push fluid, preferentially toward one side, and that flow creates a subtle chemical gradient, slightly different concentrations of signaling molecules on the left compared to the right. That first asymmetry cascades outward, instructing the heart, the liver, and every other organ where to take shape. Disrupt that spinning process even slightly, and organs can end up on the wrong side of the body entirely. Exactly what happens in situs inversus. Once researchers understood that this cilia-driven system was responsible for deciding left from right for a person's internal organs, an obvious question followed. Could the same left-right patterning machinery that positions your heart and liver also play a role in wiring the two hemispheres of your brain differently, and therefore in shaping which hand you prefer? It sounded like a stretch, connecting organ placement to something as seemingly unrelated as handwriting. But when scientists went looking for the genetic evidence, the biology actually lined up. In 2019, a research team at the University of Oxford, led by Akira Weiberg together with Gwenaëlle Duode and Dominic Furness, published a study in the journal Brain that analyzed genetic and brain imaging data from close to 400,000 people using the UK Biobank, a massive database containing health information collected from volunteers across the United Kingdom. Comparing the genomes of roughly 38,000 left-handed participants against more than 350,000 right-handed participants, the team identified 4 regions of the genome, significantly associated with hand preference. 3 of those 4 regions sat in or near genes that build proteins involved in brain development, and remarkably, 3 of them were tied specifically to the construction of microtubules, the microscopic tube-shaped scaffolding that acts like an internal skeleton and transport system inside every cell in the body. The genes involved carried names like MAPP2, MAPT, and TUB, each one playing a role in how microtubules assemble themselves and guide the growth of nerve cells as the brain wires itself together. Microtubules aren't just passive structure. During brain development, they act almost like scaffolding on a construction site that is somehow alive, constantly reorganizing itself and hauling molecular cargo along its length, physically pulling growing nerve fibers into position as the brain's 2 hemispheres connect to each other. If that scaffolding is built according to slightly different genetic instructions, the resulting wiring pattern can end up organized just a little differently too, not damaged, simply built along an alternate blueprint. And this wasn't only a statistical association buried in a spreadsheet. When the Oxford team examined brain scans from left-handed participants, they found measurable differences in the structural connections between the left and right hemispheres, particularly in regions of the brain responsible for language. And those differences correlated with the same microtubule-related genetic variants the study had identified. In other words, the genetic signal wasn't floating in the abstract. It showed up as a real physical difference in how the brain's 2 halves were wired to communicate with each other. That finding reframes what left-handedness actually is. It isn't simply about which hand happens to be a little stronger or more coordinated. It may be one of the only outwardly visible clues to a deeper asymmetry running through the architecture of the brain itself, an asymmetry that traces back to the exact same left-right patterning system, responsible for deciding where your heart and liver end up. This is also a good place to correct a popular myth. The old idea that left-handed people are simply more right-brained and therefore more creative, while right-handed people are more left-brained and more logical, It does not hold up under actual neuroscience. Language processing is still handled predominantly by the brain's left hemisphere in the vast majority of people, regardless of which hand they favor. Roughly 95% of right-handed people process language primarily in the left hemisphere. Among left-handed people, that number drops to around 70%, a genuinely interesting and measurable difference, but one that has nothing to do with simplistic claims about creativity versus logic. Handedness, it turns out, is what geneticists call a polygenic trait, meaning it isn't switched on or off by any single gene, but shaped by the combined cumulative influence of many genes, each contributing only a small nudge in one direction or another. The Oxford study was followed in 2020 by an even larger genome-wide analysis, led by researchers including Sarah Medland and colleagues, combining data from the UK Biobank, the consumer genetics company 23andMe, and dozens of studies collected through the International Handedness Consortium for a combined sample of more than 1.7 million people. That massive analysis identified 41 genetic regions associated with left-handedness and 7 more associated with being ambidextrous, confirming at an enormous scale that no single gene could ever explain the trait on its own. The study also found that the genetic overlap between left-handedness and ambidexterity was surprisingly low, suggesting these are not simply two versions of the same underlying biology, but somewhat distinct outcomes shaped by different combinations of genetic influence. This layered picture, dozens of genes each with a tiny effect, combined with prenatal developmental noise, finally explained something that had puzzled scientists for generations: why identical twins, sharing the same DNA, so often end up with different hand preferences. If handedness depended on one gene, twins should match almost every time. But if it depends on dozens of genes interacting with small, semi-random developmental events during those first delicate weeks after conception, when the cilia are spinning and the chemical gradients are forming, then even genetically identical embryos can plausibly land on different outcomes. While the genetics were being mapped, evolutionary biologists were chasing a completely different mystery. If left-handedness carries no meaningful advantage, and if living in a right-handed world of scissors, desks, and machinery puts left-handed people at a small but persistent disadvantage, why hasn't natural selection simply eliminated the trait over tens of thousands of years? Left-handedness has held steady at roughly 9 to 10% of the population, across an extraordinary range of cultures, time periods, and even, according to some researchers, studying handprints on prehistoric cave walls in France dated to around 30,000 years ago, back into the deep past, long before agriculture, writing, or cities existed. That stability across cultures and centuries is itself a clue. If left-handedness were purely a random accident or a product of upbringing, its frequency should drift wildly from place to place. It doesn't. That kind of consistency is usually the signature of biology, not culture. One of the more compelling explanations for why the trait has persisted is known as the fighting hypothesis, developed and refined in the early 2000s by French researchers Charlotte Fourie and Michel Raymond. Their argument centers on combat and competitive sport rather than everyday tool use. In a world built around physical confrontation, whether that means ancient hand-to-hand fighting or modern boxing, fencing, and tennis, a left-handed competitor holds a genuine tactical edge, simply because the overwhelming majority of opponents have spent their entire lives training against right-handed attackers, left-handed fighters. Strikes come from an unfamiliar angle. A left-handed fencer's blade approaches from a direction most opponents' instincts were never calibrated for. Fourie and Raymond found that societies with historically higher rates of interpersonal violence tended to show somewhat higher rates of left-handedness, consistent with the idea that being left-handed offered a real survival advantage in physical conflict, strong enough to offset the everyday inconvenience of navigating a world built for right-handed people. The same pattern shows up in modern sport today. Left-handed competitors are consistently overrepresented among elite fencers and boxers relative to their roughly 10% share of the general population, and left-handed pitchers in baseball facing. Batters from an angle, right-handed hitters get comparatively little practice against. None of this proves the fighting hypothesis, is the entire explanation, and researchers are careful to note that combat was almost certainly not the only pressure shaping our ancestors' survival, but it does offer a living example of the same underlying principle, an advantage that exists specifically because most competitors are unprepared for it, a dynamic evolutionary biologists sometimes call negative frequency dependent selection, where a trait's benefit is tied directly to how uncommon it remains. A related idea focuses less on combat and more on the tension between cooperation and competition within human societies. In highly cooperative environments, tools and shared systems tend to standardize around whatever the majority uses, which keeps left-handedness relatively rare because a predictable shared toolkit benefits everyone. But in more competitive or conflict-prone settings, the surprise advantage of being left-handed becomes more valuable, nudging its frequency slightly upward. Under this view, the stable global rate of left-handedness we see today may represent a long-term evolutionary balance point between the benefits of standardization and the benefits of unpredictability, playing out quietly across thousands of generations. There is also a brain-centered theory, developed by British psychologist Chris McManus and laid out in detail in his influential 2002 book on the subject, known as the right shift theory. McManus argued that having the brain's left hemisphere specialize in language and fine motor control made neural processing more efficient overall, freeing the brain from duplicating certain functions across both hemispheres. Under this model, most people inherit a genetic factor that shifts them toward right-handedness and left hemisphere language dominance, but a meaningful minority do not inherit that shifting factor, and instead develop through what is essentially a near, even random process, ending up right-handed or left-handed with roughly equal likelihood purely by chance. This theory offers a mathematically tidy explanation for why the global rate lands so consistently around 10%, and it fits comfortably alongside the genetic and developmental noise findings coming out of modern DNA studies, though, like every other theory here, it remains actively discussed and refined rather than a fully closed case. Ancient artwork hints that this trait is far older than any written record. Cave paintings in France dated to roughly 30,000 years ago include stenciled handprints on rock walls, and researchers studying the angle and spray pattern of the paint around those prints have noted that a disproportionate number appear to have been made by left-handed individuals blowing pigment around their own hand. If that interpretation holds, it suggests left-handedness isn't a modern deviation at all, but something woven into the human story since long before agriculture, writing, or cities existed. Interestingly, humans are not the only species that shows this kind of lopsided hand or paw preference. Researchers studying chimpanzees and other primates have documented individual preferences for tasks like reaching for food or cracking nuts with tools, although these preferences are far less consistent across an entire population than they are in humans. Some primatologists take this as a sign that the biological roots of hand preference stretch back millions of years into our shared evolutionary history, long before anything resembling written language or organized society existed. Another thread connecting the origin of this trait to something far older and deeper than personal habit. Alongside the genetics and the evolutionary theories, another body of research took a more cautious turn, examining possible links between left-handedness and certain health conditions. Over the decades, various studies have reported statistical associations between left-handedness and a range of conditions, including some autoimmune disorders, migraine, and more controversially, elevated rates of atypical or mixed-handedness among people with schizophrenia or autism spectrum disorder. It matters to be precise here, because this is exactly the kind of finding that tends to get exaggerated and less careful reporting. These associations, where they genuinely exist, are generally weak, inconsistent from one study to the next, and nowhere close to establishing cause and effect. Being left-handed does not mean a person is more likely to develop schizophrenia or autism, and the overwhelming majority of left-handed people carry no elevated health risk connected to their hand preference whatsoever. What some researchers suspect, cautiously, is that handedness and certain neurodevelopmental conditions may occasionally trace back to shared, very early disruptions in how the brain organizes its two hemispheres during fetal development, meaning atypical handedness might sometimes serve as a subtle marker of broader variation in brain lateralization in some individuals, rather than a cause of anything at all. This remains an active and still evolving area of research, and scientists studying it are explicit that strong conclusions should not be drawn from findings that are still preliminary and, in some cases, contradictory. There is also a persistent claim that left-handed people tend to have shorter average lifespans, a claim that traces back largely to a methodologically flawed study from the late 1980s. That study failed to properly account for the fact that older generations had been far more aggressively forced to switch to right-handed writing as children, which skewed the comparison by making left-handedness look artificially rare and therefore statistically unusual among older people who had died more recently. Later, more rigorous studies with better controls found no meaningful difference in life expectancy between left-handed and right-handed individuals at all. It is a useful example of how a flawed piece of research can circulate as accepted fact for decades after the underlying science has already moved on. What the genetic evidence has actually made clear is closer to the opposite of a health warning. The variants linked to left-handedness in the major genome studies were not found clustered inside genes associated with disease or disorder. They were found inside genes tied to entirely normal, healthy processes of brain wiring and cellular architecture. Left-handedness, based on everything the current genetic evidence shows, is not a disorder, not a defect, and not evidence that anything went wrong during development. It is a variation, one thread among many in the ordinary diversity of the human nervous system, no more inherently abnormal than being tall, having naturally curly hair, or having perfect pitch. There is still real uncertainty here, and it's worth being honest about where the science currently stands. The genome-wide association studies conducted so far have identified genetic regions correlated with handedness, but correlation in genetics is a starting point, not a finish line. Researchers still need to work out precisely how variants near genes like MAP2 influence the developing brain at a mechanistic level, why the effect appears connected specifically to language-related brain regions, and how much of the remaining variation comes down to other genetic factors not yet discovered versus pure developmental randomness that may never be fully mapped. There's also a deeper, still unresolved question hanging over all of this. Why do humans lean so heavily toward right-handedness in the first place, when the underlying developmental system, driven by essentially random, silly emotion in the earliest embryo, might on its own be expected to produce something closer to an even 50-50 split between left and right? Some researchers argue the answer lies in the evolution of language itself, that as the brain's left hemisphere became specialized for speech, it also became specialized, almost as a side effect, for controlling fine motor movement on the right side of the body. Under this view, strong right-hand dominance across most of the population is a relatively late evolutionary layer, built on top of an older, more balanced system, one that a genetic minority of people simply never fully inherited. It remains an active hypothesis, rather than settled fact, one more open question, in a story that keeps turning out to be more intricate the closer scientists look. What makes this whole investigation so striking isn't just the science on its own terms, remarkable as it is. It's what the science reveals about where a trait like this actually comes from. Not from discipline, not from upbringing, not from moral character, but from a rotating cluster of microscopic hairs inside a 3-week-old embryo, from dozens of genes nudging microscopic scaffolding into place inside growing nerve cells, and from millions of years of evolutionary pressure, balancing the advantages of blending in against the advantages of standing out. The hand you write with traces back further than your childhood, further than your parents, further even than the moment you were born, all the way to one of the very first decisions your body ever made about which side of you would be which. For centuries, people looked at left-handedness and searched for someone or something to blame. The DNA tells a different story, one written not in superstition but in molecular biology. And it turns out that even the smallest, most ordinary habits we carry can be rooted in processes stretching back to the very first cells of our own existence. If you're left-handed, you are quite literally carrying the outcome of one of the earliest and most delicate decisions your body ever made. A decision spun into motion before your parents ever knew your name, echoed across thousands of generations of human history, and written into your biology long before the world had any say in the matter. If this dive into the science of handedness fascinated you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden biology shaping who we are, and let me know in the comments whether you're left-handed, right-handed, or somewhere in between, and if anyone ever tried to make you switch.